Blanca Lilia Ibarra Cadenas.
Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a esta última sesión de este importante seminario. Agradezco la invitación y es un privilegio estar aquí moderando en esta mesa de especialistas. Este es el panel titulado Rendición de Cuentas y Control Democrático de lo Público, que considero tiene una pertinencia relevante, toda vez que reúne el binomio indisoluble que, por un lado, está implícito en un Estado de Derecho y en un Estado democrático que exige justamente la rendición de cuentas por parte de los servidores públicos y, por el otro lado, la exigencia ciudadana de que los servidores públicos justifiquen sus acciones y rindan cuentas sobre el uso de los recursos públicos. Por eso, en este panel se convocó a destacados especialistas que hoy nos acompañan, que entre otras cosas nos van a dar a conocer casos muy puntuales de manera específica sobre un tema que, según las exposiciones de esta mañana, aún está pendiente en la agenda pública de México y que tiene que ver con el control del poder. Vamos a dar inicio a continuación con la exposición de Mel Dobnik, que es uno de nuestros primeros expositores. Por casi 3 décadas, el trabajo de investigación de Dobnik ha estado dirigido a la rendición de cuentas y la gobernabilidad en los sectores público, sin fines de lucro y privado. Su enfoque principal se dirige al ámbito conceptual y de investigación de temas relacionados con la rendición de cuentas y en cómo desarrollar reformas de gobiernos realistas y creíbles que mejoren los sistemas de rendición de cuentas. Mel Dobnik es coautor de textos relativos al análisis de políticas públicas, administración pública y gobierno americano. Otras publicaciones que ha desarrollado en su trayectoria como investigador tienen que ver con temas relacionados a la planeación del desarrollo en países subdesarrollados, seguridad nacional y seguridad social, políticas de regulación gubernamental y relaciones intergubernamentales, entre otros. Recibimos a Mel Dobnik en esta primera intervención. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And first, let me begin by thanking the network for the invitation. And it was an exciting experience getting here with all sorts of interesting travel rearrangements. But listening to that introduction, I'm getting to the point in my life that I keep on forgetting about all those different topics that I did. But today I'm actually privileged to in a way, do part 2 of the accountability studies that Professor Fredrickson and I have been working on for a few years together. And I'm not going to repeat. I'm going to use some of the concepts that Professor Fredrickson used, but not going to go over the same territory. In fact, I've chosen for the topic, given the nature of the panel and the fact that it's the last panel on the schedule today, I decided to really focus in on strategic options. That, given the fact that corruption is such a major issue in terms of the agenda for Mexico nationally as well as locally, and given the significant interest in accountability, I thought it would be interesting to look at strategic options when you take those two concepts together. So let me just, I'm using the PowerPoint in part because more for me than for you to keep me on track, but I think it provides a basic outline for the points I want to make. Here's hoping. Okay. Let me start off by highlighting what I regard as the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom that probably most of you probably adhere to. And it's a conventional wisdom that says corruption and accountability are linked together. That if you have one, you're basically going to impact the other. I guess the basic assumption here, and I think I have this, the two basic assumptions. One is that to be corrupt is to be unaccountable. There are all sorts of definitions of what corruption is, but there is this idea that the key to corruption is the lack of accountability. And I have sort of this secondary assumption that it follows that the unaccountable individual is inherently corruptible, that even if they aren't corrupt, they're susceptible to being corrupt or being corrupted. The second assumption under the conventional wisdom is that in order to reduce corruption, we need to impose, increase, or otherwise enhance accountability. And again, a little secondary assumption here, and that is that the greater the accountability, greater accountability does not necessarily make you any less corruptible, but what it does is makes it less likely that you will turn toward corruption if you were tempted by the situation. So that's the conventional wisdom, and that's basically where most of us start with. Now, I want to give you the academic wisdom, and I put wisdom in scare quotes there to emphasize that it's not so much wisdom as it is just sort of insights that we have that we wouldn't necessarily claim to be authoritative in the sense that we're not certain about. So let me just tell you what the academic wisdom would be. First of all, regarding that first assumption, let me go back just to make sure we got that. The first assumption, to be corrupt is to be unaccountable. I'd say that we're not quite certain about that. Academic studies have raised a number of issues about this assumption. First of all, corruption takes many forms. It's hard to limit it to just unaccountable types of a corruption. Corruption sometimes it happens with a great deal of accountability. There are situations where even the most stringently accountable agency or actor is going to end up in a situation where they end up being accused of corruption, because corruption is this loose concept, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There's also, in academic studies, some very classic ones dating back to the 1930s, in fact, the idea that there are benefits to corruption. I know that sounds like sacrilege, but there is the famous Robert Merton argument that, in fact, the corrupt city governments of the turn of the century in the United States, in fact, performed a very positive service in the sense of the populations that they served, the new immigrant populations and others who were sort of left out of the system, and they were brought into the system through what we would today regard, and even those days were regarded as corrupt mayors, corrupt politicians who would essentially buy their vote. But they would buy their vote in return for providing them services. And so in the sociological studies of the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of attention paid to what we would call the benefits of corruption today. We don't speak much about that because it's something we don't want to acknowledge. And the third point, and I think it's something that's not stressed enough, is what I call the evil of accountable regimes. It may be difficult to think of accountability in Nazi Germany, to give you an example. But if you read up on the Holocaust and you read up on the way in which the Holocaust was carried out, one thing that strikes you is that this was a very accountable system. Records were kept. Things were done systematically. People who did not follow through on orders were held to account. It was a very structured system. In a sense, the German culture is a very accountable culture. And yet you could hardly think that this accountability and the evil that it generated deserves to be held up in a high regard. And you could come up with other examples. That's probably an extreme. But accountability regimes can, in fact, do evil things. Accountability does not assure good behavior, or ethical behavior, or moral behavior. Now, on the assumption that accountability will make things better. Again, I think academics would look at that and say, well, it's an interesting statement, but there's some things that come up in our studies that seem to indicate that that's not quite the case all the time. Professor Fredrickson pointed out the theme of the promises of accountability. Oftentimes, we hold accountability to be so effective when it's done right that it will bring about democracy, that it will bring about a justice, that will bring about better, more efficient performance. But some of those promises have proven to be false. Sometimes accountability doesn't really pay off the way we think it's going to pay off. In a sense, the promises of accountability shouldn't be taken for granted. Whether or not accountability actually makes a positive difference really depends on a lot of different factors. And we tend to keep it, the assumption tends to assume that a more accountable regime is actually going to reduce corruption. And I guess I would say in academic terms, that's an empirical question. Some forms of accountability, it could be argued, actually make corruption more likely. And here I will turn again to the example that Professor Fredrickson used and the kinds of situations that you're being faced with this very day in terms of decisions about education reform. The No Child Left Behind Act, which was as well-meaning as you could possibly have and thought out, very good theory behind it, good intentions behind it, and yet those high-stakes accountability systems ended up creating the atmosphere that fostered corruption in a lot of school districts. There are all sorts of examples that have been making headlines locally and nationally in the U.S. about the degree to which teachers, principals, superintendents of schools, districts, being so anxious about what the possible ramifications were of scoring poorly that they ended up promoting or participating in systems of cheating, corruption. And if you have an accountability system that actually fosters or has people think that it's to their benefit to become corrupt, then you have to take a second look at that assumption that accountability is necessarily going to improve the situation when it comes to corruption. It may, in fact, make corruption more inviting. Right? So let me continue just a minute on a couple more of the academic problems of those of us who study accountability. First of all, there are conceptual problems. The first thing I think people who study corruption and people who study accountability realize is that the very terms that they're of the subject matter are difficult to define. What constitutes corruption? We've heard all sorts of versions of it just in the presentations before now. Corruption being an illegal act, I think that's maybe obvious. Corruption being an unethical act, even though not illegal, an act that makes things worse for the society. Professor Lawrence Lessig of Harvard has been on a campaign to demonstrate to the American public that the U.S. political system suffers from systemic corruption, mainly having to do with our campaign finance arrangements. That even though it's perfectly legal for people to pay politicians through fundraising mechanisms exorbitant amounts of money, it's perfectly legal, there's something that's happened to the system that has made it corrupted. And his point is that, legal or not, we have to pay attention to the damage that's being done to the system by a very highly legal, highly questionable in terms of ethics, but still highly regarded system that's accepted by everybody. Even the most honored elected official, in order to get reelected, has to go out and raise money. And we've had many examples, well, a few prominent examples of major politicians who just sort of decided to give up their office because they just couldn't take the pressures of having to spend all their time raising money and not really engaging in what they thought they were being elected to do, and that is to govern. Same problem happens with accountability. I've been engaged probably for the past 20 years with trying to come up with a definition, or at least a conception of accountability. And one of the first things I ran into, and you'll notice this in the second example there, you notice a bit of Portuguese slipping in here, not Spanish, is that when I first started talking about accountability, I went to give a lecture on it at University of Goiás in Brazil. And when they asked me what I wanted to talk about, I sent them a few weeks in advance. I said, I want to talk about responsibility and accountability in the new Brazil regime. This was right after the military government gave way to a democratically elected government. And I showed up for the lunch before the lecture, and it was all very nice, and we were starting to walk toward the lecture hall. I was giving a lecture after the meal, and I noticed an obvious advertisement for my lecture. I mean, there was my name plastered on the wall, except the title was Responsabilidade in the Brazilian Regime. And I said, well, where's the word accountability? And the simultaneous translator who was walking along with me, he says, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have such a word. That the word for accountability is responsabilidade. Now, I was reminded of that story when I noticed that even though in English this seminar is accountability, the word that you use for accountability that really amounts to rendering of an account, which for those of us who study accountability in a broader sense is very, very narrow wording for a very broad concept and a very important concept. We include things like obligation, fidelity, all sorts of other things under what Professor Fredrickson noted was the synonyms that are attached to accountability. So we have these conceptual problems, and that makes it difficult for us to study exactly what we're talking about. There's also the empirical evidence, and this will be the last academic part I'll burden you with. There aren't, even though there are a lot of studies of accountability coming out, and it's proliferated in the past 25 years since, I guess some of us regard 1987 with the publication of a couple of pieces on accountability as a watershed year, but the 25 years since, there have been volumes almost of studies of accountability, publications, academic studies, and yet very few of them actually test out those basic assumptions. So we don't have the empirical evidence to prove, or at least substantiate the argument that accountability improves performance, enhances democracy, brings about justice. There are anecdotal case studies, but there's no real evidence. And then there are the studies that are counterintuitive, that really fly in the face of our assumptions. The empirical studies. There's one that, as yet unpublished, but it's a study of Mexican voting behavior in Mexican communities, and done by a team out of Yale, Princeton, and Ottawa. Nobody from Mexico involved, but it was an interesting study that I stumbled across, and it's sure to be published soon. And effectively, they were testing the proposition that if you give voters more information, if you make things more transparent, especially information about corruption, that the assumption is that that will make the voters hold the public officials to account. And what they found was very interesting, and that is not that it had the opposite effect, but that it basically ended up turning voters into indifferent people. In other words, they began to ignore politics. They became so disgusted with politics that they turned their back on politics. Too much information turned out to be not having a positive effect at all, and in fact turning people off because it sort of confirmed what they always felt, and that is, everything's corrupt, why should I even go vote? There are other studies done mainly in Southeast Asia that actually show something else that we're familiar with on an anecdotal basis in the US, and that is even when you have people who are accused and convicted of corruptible behavior, if they wish they could stand for election again, and they get elected overwhelmingly. In other words, for a lot of populations, they love their mayor, even though he's corrupt, a crook, and would re-elect him because, let's say, regardless of the fact that they are proven criminals. And we see this happening several different instances, again, mainly anecdotal, but there is some systematic studies of this happening, again, mainly out of Southeast Asia. Okay, so let me leave the, did I just turn that on? Let me leave the academic part behind because I know the question basically is what do policymakers want? And one thing I know they don't want is they don't want people to raise academic questions and raise all these doubts about it. What policymakers do want is that they want ideas to deal with the problem of corruption, and they want the ideas to be put forward now. And so I'm going to, in spite of all my doubts and all my questions, I'm going to offer a framework for thinking about the connection between accountability and anti-corruption in terms of strategies. And it's just a framework. It's just a different way of really saying things that have been said all morning, all day, in terms of the types of things that can be done to deal with accountability. And I work, I tend to work in 2x2s. I'm infamous for it. And I'm sorry that's not coming up as well as I thought it would. But essentially, if you look at, and this is part of the academic conclusions that a lot of people who study corruption and anti-corruption say, there are basically two strategies. There's a top-down strategy, reform coming from the center, the very thing that's happening with education reform here. It's a No Child Left Behind. And then there's the bottom-up anti-corruption, the kinds of things that happen when a community is mobilized, when a civil society decides, hold it a second, we're just not going to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. On the other dimension, and again I apologize for the problems with that, on the other dimension is the two accountability strategies that were highlighted in Professor Fredrickson's view of accountability, his presentation. And that is there are strategies that are post-factum focused, going to after the accident happens, to find out who was to blame and hold them accountable. Then there's pre-factum strategies, those that attempt to design systems to prevent, or at least prevent very great damage, but try to prevent the accidents or the faux pas or the error altogether. And of course, as is usual with 2x2s, you end up with 4 different types. So I'm just going to briefly go over each one of these types. And again, by now they're familiar to you. I'm giving the title Type 1 strategies to those that are characterized by top-down reforms that are pre-factum. And again, the example would be the one that's out in the streets right now. The attempt to reform education in order to make it more efficient, effective, responsive is being done on the idea that if we only set up the right kind of assessment, high-stakes testing and assessment process, we will get better education outcomes. All right? That's a type 1 type of reform. Or declaring an act illegal, basically saying taking a bribe is punishable by imprisonment. That's a pre-factum strategy. Now, type 2 is, well, you could think of it as being the other side of the pre-factum in the sense that you could have all the laws and all the policies you want in terms of saying we want to prevent accountability, but unless somebody is ready to enforce it, unless somebody is willing to prosecute, unless somebody is willing to issue a lawsuit because of negligence, unless somebody is willing to take that kind of approach, then corruption is going to be sustained. And so you have these strategies that basically say we're going to give the prosecutors, the public, and anybody else who wants it, the ability to go after corrupt officials. Okay. Now, type 3, let's see if I push this right, the type 3 reforms are also post factum, after the fact, But they come from the bottom. And I think the best example here are investigative reporters. They go out, they find something that they regard as scandalous, a major error, something that indicates corruption, and they make it a big news story, and in the process stir up the local community to generate demands that something has to be done. Now, this could also be done by NGOs that are forming to, again, go out there and find examples of poor governance or inefficient governance and do the same thing. The most visible type tends to be the investigative report, but that's because the media is a powerful force. But those are type 3 strategies. And then there's the type 4 strategies, and for that I reserve the kinds of things that Dan Schneider was talking about. Building a civil society, taking a long-term approach, saying that you have to basically develop a bottom-up sense of what's right and wrong, what's acceptable and not acceptable, the moral education of people, but also the development of those groups and political dynamics and social dynamics that make it undesirable for people to engage in corruption. And that is, I think, a long-term strategy. It's not the kind that essentially will get the immediate reaction, of politicians because they want the quick fix, but if they take the long view, as a lot of reform organizations, a lot of organizations represented here do, then it would be that type 4 strategy that would probably make the case. So I'm just going to leave it with the idea of that there are these 4 strategies. The reality is no one strategy is going to be the answer. In fact, the strategies to deal with corruption through accountability is to really take on all 4 approaches, but to really understand that you have these choices to make, and that even though you might be going after the immediate wrongdoing, the immediate corrupt act, you should also pay attention to developing the capabilities of a civil society to take care of corruption so that it never happens, or hopefully never happens. Thank you.
Gracias al doctor Mel Dobnik. Agradecemos su valiosa intervención que sin duda no solamente inició dándonos justamente esta relación que hay entre lo que es el problema conceptual y por otro lado un segundo problema que es empírico para lograr ponernos de acuerdo en este tema y esta relación directa que por un lado tiene que ver justamente con lo que es la corrupción y su relación directa con la falta de rendición de cuentas. Ha sido muy puntual en señalar las estrategias para construir justamente esta rendición de cuentas y nos ha dejado entrever el por qué no siempre la rendición de cuentas logra sus objetivos por sí sola, mejorando las cosas. Sin embargo, existen referencias que no siempre suceden. Vamos a dar paso a continuación a otro de nuestros ponentes, Michael Evans. Él es analista y director del Proyecto Colombia del Archivo de Seguridad Nacional de la Universidad de George Washington. Es editor de Colombia and the United States Political Violence, Narcotics and Human Rights, una colección de más de 3,000 documentos desclasificados sobre la violencia política y la política de Estados Unidos en Colombia. Evans es colaborador frecuente del medio informativo colombiano, semana.com, publicación digital de una de las revistas más prestigiadas de aquel país. Su trabajo ha sido comentado y citado por el New York Times, USA Today, Los Angeles Times y The Washington Post. Tiene la palabra Michael Evans.
Gracias, Liliana. Disculpe. Damas y caballeros, es un placer estar aquí contigo o con ustedes. Desafortunadamente no voy a seguir en español porque yo creo que, por una mano mi presentación está escrito en inglés, pues no hay nada que yo pueda hacer. Y también les aseguro que será mucho más fácil para los traductores si yo utilizo mi lengua nativa en lugar de forzarles a traducir mi español poco elegante a inglés. Pues, so I'll switch to English now. I'm glad that Mel mentioned the sort of different categories of accountability, because my presentation is going to be a little bit different, I think, than most of the others that you've heard. We take a decidedly, I think it was his type 3 post-factum bottom-up approach, the one he described as being utilized by investigative journalists. And that's kind of what we are, although we're not simply journalists as much as we are sort of a combination of different disciplines. At the moment, my particular research projects involve Colombia and US policy toward Colombia, and also Mexico, which I think I failed to mention, and the issue of migration and border security, and sort of investigating archives on both sides of the border. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. But I've been asked to talk today not about the projects that I direct, but specifically about how the work of the National Security Archive impacts accountability, broadly speaking. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not going to spend any time talking about accountability theory or categorizations of accountability or how to think about accountability. So what I am going to do is spend some time sharing examples of how the National Security Archive, where I work, through the Freedom of Information Act, which, by the way, in English we say FOIA for Freedom of Information Act, but that gets me into trouble a lot in Spanish. So instead I'm going to say FOIA. Nobody laughed, so I'm not sure if you understand what I'm talking about. But anyway, how our use of the Freedom of Information Act has an impact on accountability in the United States and in other parts of the world. Oh good, it worked. So we have sort of one basic organizing principle at the National Security Archive, and that's to promote transparency and accountability through the promotion of transparency. Our focus is specifically on diplomacy, military affairs, national security policy, intelligence policy, and those sorts of things. Essentially the policies that are most secret. The primary tool we use, again, is the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA. We are the largest non-governmental archive of declassified documents, as far as I know, in the world, and the most prolific user of the Freedom of Information Act. We make more than 1,000 requests every year, and that's just to the United States government. More and more, we are also making requests in other countries under other access laws, including Mexico, as I mentioned. So yeah, like we are sort of in Professor Dubnik's type 3, we kind of consider ourselves to be like forensic historians. We combine history, advocacy for transparency, journalism, and archival research to promote accountability. Basically, it breaks down into 3 categories. There's accountability for national security policymakers who create and implement policies mostly in secrecy. Then there's public oversight of how the federal government in the United States, how they respond to the Freedom of Information Act. And we have kind of one of the most scientific things we do, and I'm not sure that it's really very scientific, is conduct every year what we call a FOIA audit, which is a way of using the Freedom of Information Act to also test the way the system works, and sort of putting multiple government agencies to the same test and measuring how they respond. And the final way is, and one of the most interesting ways, and one of the things that I work on the most, is using the Freedom of Information Act to investigate human rights abuses in the US and internationally. There's tremendous cost, first of all, to secrecy and keeping things secret. In the United States, 15 million new secrets, more or less, are created every year, which costs about $7 billion. on top of course, all of the secrets that were created last year and the year before and the cost of maintaining those secrets. I think there's not a lot of focus on that, but it really is an incredibly expensive thing to keep information secret. Not just background checks and security clearances, but just the vaults that they actually use and sort of the bureaucracy that's created. It's an incredible amount of money. And it's also costly, I think, at a policy-making level if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing or doesn't have the same information. There was a very high-level commission in the United States led by an esteemed US senator in 1997 about secrecy that found that secrecy in the United States, to nobody's great surprise, was excessive. Interestingly, they considered it to be a form of government regulation, which of course comes with its own costs. There's a few examples that are very relevant. The Bush White House, that's the most recent Bush White House, W. They deleted as many as 22 million emails. These were, to some extent, they were emails that were used on the Republican National Committee's email servers and various other things, and a lawsuit that we, the archive, brought along with some other groups helped to actually recover and restore some of those emails, or many of them, most of them. We found out a few days ago from a report in the Washington Post based on information leaked by Edward Snowden, who's come up in previous discussions today, that the intelligence community's so-called black budget, secret budget, is something around the total of $52.6 billion for 2013. But the interesting thing that we got out of that article for the first time ever is the total breakdown of that budget. So, the intelligence community is a tremendous number of organizations, the CIA, the National Security Agency, all kinds of agencies of the Department of Defense, even the State Department, which is a very, very, very small of the part of the black budget. It broke it down into all those different categories. It's extremely fascinating. I would encourage anybody who's interested in the intelligence community in the United States and how that sort of thing works to go back to the Washington Post a couple of days ago and look at that report, because it's really an extraordinary thing to have it all broken down like that. And the real big takeaway from that, one of them was that they had listed, I think, six priority countries as intelligence targets for the United States. This is information that we didn't know, right? So some of them were obvious. North Korea, Russia, China, Pakistan was on the list. Israel, interestingly, was on the list, but not a terribly great surprise given their importance to sort of world events. But the sixth one that I thought was amazing was Cuba. Now, I understand that the United States and Cuba don't have a particularly great relationship, but the idea that we're spending the same kinds of resources investigating or sort of trying to gather information on Cuba as we are in these other countries, which may not actually be the case, is something pretty remarkable. There's also the culture of secrecy. I think there's been a lot written about this in the months and years prior to 9/11. There was a lot of signals that were missed. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had some very pertinent information about some Middle Eastern individuals who were taking flight lessons in the United States and who weren't interested in learning how to land the planes and those sorts of things. Information that wasn't shared with the necessary people at the other part of the FBI. Anyway, you can sort of see, I'm spending too much time on this, but the costs of secrecy are very high. The Freedom of Information Act, briefly, I'll go through this, is again, the single most important tool that we have to do our work. It ensures public access to just federal records, although there are states and municipalities that have access laws as well. It's very easy to file a request. Anybody can do it, anybody from anywhere in the world. They have to release the information unless it falls under one of the exemptions. It's very similar in a way to the law here in Mexico that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, although I think the Mexican law is actually better. You can appeal those responses, et cetera. It doesn't cover the Congress, it doesn't cover the courts, it doesn't cover presidential records. There are a number of limitations. It takes a lot of time, it can cost a lot of money if you don't qualify as a news media organization like we do, or as an educational organization as a university professor would. But it's worthwhile, and it's particularly worthwhile if you have an organization set up to do that exact thing. Anyway, I want to get to some of the ways that we actually believe that we promote accountability. In foreign policy, the archive began in the 80s. A number of investigative journalists got together. They had all been using the Freedom of Information Act for various things and decided to create this organization as just basically a place to put all this stuff. They had all these declassified records, and they said, why don't we create a centralized repository? Well, one of the first things that happened that was really pretty remarkable was that they happened to have a project about the Iran Revolution, and on the other hand, they happened to have a project about the revolution in Nicaragua and the Contras and sort of all that was happening there. And then the Iran-Contra scandal happened, linking those two projects in a way that they never thought would happen. They literally took the two chronologies that they had developed for these different projects and put them together and created one project on the Iran-Contra scandal. They published a book called The Chronology, which is really just basic information about all of the very detailed chronology about what was going on in Iran, what was going on in Nicaragua, and sort of how the various arms for hostages deals went down. It was one of the things that really put the National Security Archive on the map to begin with. Oliver North's notebooks were one of the things that we were able to get declassified, and this is actually his handwritten notebooks from the period when he was at the National Security Council, talking about how some of these planes they were using to run arms down to the Contras were probably, in his words, probably being used for drug runs into the United States. I'm going to move on quickly and try to share some more examples. We've heard a lot about the National Security Agency and their domestic spying, thanks to Snowden again. But 8 years ago and years before that, we at the archive had been following the intelligence community and everything that we can find out through the Freedom of Information Act and publishing information. We've been doing that for years. And in 2005, we came up with this document. It was from the transition period between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration in 2001. And it's the NSA's transition document for the new president. And they said, the post-war, Cold War environment demands policy recognition that the NSA will be a powerful presence on a global telecommunications infrastructure where protected American communications and targeted adversary communications will coexist. Of course, the main issue in the United States being the communications of Americans, or what they call US persons, in the United States. And here you have these suggestions in this transition document for the new president, President Bush, that things are changing. It's becoming harder you have to read between the lines, but it's becoming harder for them to distinguish between what is legal and what's illegal. They say the volumes and routing of data make finding and processing nuggets of intelligence information more difficult. To perform both its offensive and defensive missions, NSA must, quote, live on the network. And of course, now we know that they're tapping the undersea cables and all of the various sort of backbone architecture of the internet. And this is what they were talking about. 9/11, of course, September 11th, 2001, everybody knows about the attacks on the United States. That prompted a pretty serious and heated debate in the United States among policymakers, mainly between Clinton administration officials who said, we told you Al-Qaeda was going to attack, and the Bush administration officials who said, no, you didn't, you never told us anything. And we were finally able to get this memo declassified, called what we call the Clark Memo. Richard Clark, Americans who follow national security policy will probably know who he is, but he was a very high-level Clinton administration official, very seriously involved in counterterrorism efforts. And he had said, yes, we wrote this memo for the incoming administration, to Condoleezza Rice, the new national security advisor. He said, my hair was on fire. We urgently need a top-level review of the terrorist network, Al-Qaeda. And she said, no, there was no strategy, there was no plan, and went back and forth. And then this memo was declassified, and lo and behold, he says, Al-Qaeda is not some little narrow terrorist issue. He called for planning meetings on how to deal with the issue. This is all before 9/11. And again, this is, I think, a very good, a very good example of this kind of post-factum sort of accountability. At least, sort of in the way history will be written about this period. Another way, and I think a more sort of direct, concrete way that we hold the government accountable that I alluded to earlier, are these what we call FOIA audits. and just general legal maneuvers to enforce records preservation. I mentioned email before and the Bush administration's destruction of email messages. But our experience with email goes back to the late 1980s, long before anybody outside of the White House and the Defense Department were using email. At that point, it became known that the departing Bush administration, that's the elder father Bush, as they were coming into office after the Reagan years, that there was this, we got word essentially that this email that nobody really knew what it was, but they had been doing a lot of communication on that. Is that a record? Is that a federal record? Is that something that the Freedom of Information Act was meant to cover? Nobody knew. It seems like it should be, but it wasn't clear. So through a series of legal actions, we were able to make sure that the Reagan and Bush White House had to save their email. I mean, it's quite likely that if the National Security Archive had not intervened at that time, that at least the emails from that period would have been lost. And we're talking about, not just people's emails about their pets or something. I mean, we're talking about the National Security Council. We're talking about not just the daily routine exercise of foreign policy and national security policy, but potentially very scandalous behavior. I mean, the Iran-Contra scandal, for example, directly involved the National Security Council and a number of intelligence agencies. And then I mentioned, of course, the legal action more recently where we were able to force them to find the backup tapes, and through a series of court actions that took a lot of time and a lot of effort to get this Bush administration to go back and find and preserve something like 22 million emails, the record, essentially, of that government. Okay. So I mentioned these audits, and I think this is one of the most directly relevant pieces here. Every year for the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe more, we have done one of these audits where we will decide on some issue and then send a request to every agency that we can think of to see how they respond to it. One of the most interesting ones was to send a request to every agency asking them for copies of the 10 oldest Freedom of Information Act requests they have that are still pending, that they haven't responded to yet. 5 of these agencies have requests more than 15 years old. The oldest pending request at that point was 20 years old. I mean, if it was a person, it would have graduated high school already. Another thing was we used one of these audits to probe the increasing use of what they call sensitive but unclassified information. This is a sort of pseudo-classification that the government uses for information that's not strictly classified, but that they also don't want to release. Okay, 2 minutes. Anyway, I'm going to move on quickly to human rights to talk about a few of these issues where the archive has actually been able to use declassification and the Freedom of Information Act to uncover evidence that has been used in trials. Again, post-factum accountability, but still holding people to account, holding policymakers to account. The reasons why you want to use declassified documents to study human rights in other countries are fairly obvious. We have a very big intelligence and diplomatic reporting system. The Freedom of Information Act works pretty well. It's a good way to actually learn a lot about not just US policy in other countries, but what's happening in other countries. For instance, a document on what they call the Operation Condor program in the Southern Cone helped convict, earlier this year was entered into evidence in a case against the former junta chiefs in Argentina. I mean, we're talking about people who were in power 30 years ago and more, who are only now being held to account in their own countries. So, through the Freedom of Information Act, we're actually able to come up with historical evidence, that they say, Southern Cone states joining forces to eradicate subversion, a word which increasingly translates into nonviolent dissent from the left and center left. A similar document in a different but related case in Argentina uncovered evidence that Reagan administrations knew very well that the Argentine military and other people in the junta were kidnapping the children of the people they disappeared and sending them off, to be adopted. by often it's members of the military or people in the junta. And that case, which resulted in a very high conviction in Argentina, many of you have probably heard about it, relied on the testimony of a Reagan administration official who was called to testimony because we were able to uncover a document where he discussed how this was happening, in a discussion with the ambassador, Argentine ambassador. Moving on, there are a number of things, evidence archive that we found, evidence that we found through the Freedom of Information Act helped to convict Alberto Fujimori in Peru. It described how their intelligence services worked, how there was a two-level program that was like an ostensible public message, and then there was a secret program that essentially relied on death squads. In Mexico, recently, we've found some information about the San Fernando massacres, which happened only a couple of years ago. It's not very common to have documents that are only 2 and 3 years old, but in this case, it's advantageous. I think some of you know that there are some issues before EFI right now about whether or not Article 19, the transparency group, will have access or will be able to force the government, in this case the prosecutor's office, to release certain information about how that investigation's going. And we found information that where the United States was reporting back and saying, well, the Mexican government is basically trying to avoid responsibility, their responsibility for not protecting the highways in Tamaulipas. These are people who were pulled off of buses, most of them migrants, who were pulled off of buses and kidnapped and killed because they didn't want to work for the cartels. Here's one of the documents. I assume that they're going to make this PowerPoint presentation available to all of the people who registered at the conference, so you can look through this yourself if you like. It was also picked up by some of the US press. One case I wanted to talk about, I know I don't have any time left, but I think it's actually a very, very interesting case, and it's one that I specifically have worked on and I'm very proud of, is the way we've been able to get, through the Freedom of Information Act, used in a very sort of novel way, we've been able to uncover corporate records, records of the Chiquita Brands International Corporation and their illegal payments to terrorist groups in Colombia. To make a long story, a very long story, very short, they admitted that they had done this in 2007, reached a plea deal with the Department of Justice. There were never any criminal convictions of individuals at the company. They paid a $25 million fine in what is still the only case where a major US corporation has been convicted of aiding a terrorist group. Now try to imagine if Chiquita had been convicted of aiding Al-Qaeda, if they would have been treated so leniently. We were able to, because virtue of the fact that the Department of Justice had investigated them and that the Securities and Exchange Commission had done an investigation of those illegal payments and other illegal activities by Chiquita in Colombia, we were able to send a request for those investigative files. Chiquita had turned over a lot of their documents as part of their agreement to work with the Department of Justice and part of their obligation to the SEC investigation. And now, those are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And so we've been pursuing that. And the most interesting aspect of this, and I'll just leave you with this, is that earlier this year, we've been fighting the SEC in a lawsuit to force them to just actually do the review of the Chiquita records they have and to respond to us. They have thousands. I mean, it's like 24 boxes of material. And they've been delaying and delaying, and finally they started producing material. And at exactly the moment when they were going to release the most interesting stuff, Chiquita stepped in and filed what they call a reverse Freedom of Information Act request. It's not actually called that, but that is sort of the layman's language for it, where they are basically trying to stop the SEC from releasing the information that the SEC already has agreed to release to us. So we're in a situation now where instead of fighting against a federal agency, which is what we normally do for the release of information, the federal agency has already decided in our favor, and now we have to fight against a huge, very well-financed corporation who is trying to stop us from revealing information about crimes that they have already admitted to. There are complicated reasons why it's worthwhile to continue to pursue the information, mainly because the fine was so light, and also because there are a number of civil suits against Chiquita now related to the financing of the terror groups in Colombia, and also a preliminary investigation in Colombia criminal investigation of some of the company officials. So that is the short version of my presentation. I'll stop there and we'll hand it over to Alejandro. Thank you.
Gracias a Michael Evans. En México decimos que el que busca encuentra, y como buen periodista observamos que tienes evidencias a partir justamente de estas investigaciones que has hecho y que nos ha permitido que tu exposición sea muy ilustrativa, justamente con ejemplos de información que se ha desclasificado de México, Estados Unidos y Colombia. Concluye tu exposición con un tema fundamental donde señalas justamente que el control democrático pasa por el ejercicio de los derechos ciudadanos y el acceso a la información, sin duda, no solo para los periodistas, sino para la población en general, es una herramienta muy útil que nos permite darle seguimiento a los asuntos públicos. Muchas gracias, Michael. Y pasamos a continuación, después de haber escuchado primero a un investigador, después a un periodista y ahora a un justamente mexicano de excepción también, profesor, investigador del Colegio de la Frontera Norte, un académico. Él trabaja en el Departamento de Estudios de Administración Pública, actualmente es director general de docencia de esa misma institución, miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Sus líneas de investigación combinan el interés por la teoría de la democracia con el estudio de la rendición de cuentas, el cambio institucional y la política deliberativa. Es coeditor del Deterioro de la Democracia y tiene otras publicaciones importantes que en este momento, por razón de tiempo, voy a omitir. Damos la palabra a Alejandro Monsiváis. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Blanca Lilia. Muy buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Es verdaderamente una distinción participar en este seminario con tan distinguidos panelistas que me han precedido a lo largo de la jornada. Yo tengo también una presentación en PowerPoint que probablemente sea de utilidad proyectarla. De entrada quiero decir lo siguiente. Agradezco mucho la invitación a los organizadores de este evento que implica una coordinación logística impresionante. Y quiero decirles que lo que presentaré se inscribe en dos discusiones principales. Por un lado, la necesidad de debatir la relevancia de la rendición de cuentas en México, la transformación del sistema de rendición de cuentas en México, que constituye un eje indispensable, fundamental de la transformación que demanda y requiere este país y que en alguna medida está presente, pero también está ausente de la agenda nacional, de la agenda legislativa que se está debatiendo actualmente. Y en ese sentido, no puedo sino celebrar de una manera muy entusiasta las iniciativas como las que está tomando la Red por la Rendición de Cuentas, ya que es fundamentalmente desde la sociedad civil, desde el debate académico, que se están proponiendo temas centrales, temas indispensables para transformar el sistema de rendición de cuentas en México. Sin ninguna duda que el trabajo que ha realizado Mauricio Merino, uno de los organizadores de este seminario, junto con otros colaboradores en el CIDE, por ejemplo, el libro publicado, La estructura de la rendición de cuentas, es clave para repensar de una manera integrada la reconstrucción de este sistema. Y es en ese sentido que se inscribe, en este marco que se inscribe en mi presentación. Es necesario repensar la integralidad y la coordinación de un sistema que pueda sancionar, que pueda evaluar, que pueda supervisar el quehacer de la función pública. Y el segundo campo en el cual se inscribe lo que presentaré es el de la participación ciudadana. Hay, sin ninguna duda, una efervescencia pública en México de larga data que ha empujado por distintas formas de cambio, de renovación institucional y que, sin embargo, no ha sido del todo incorporada, como mostraré más adelante, y al mismo tiempo necesita ser repensada también en el debate académico y en la agenda de la política pública. Fundamentalmente, les presento lo siguiente. Abordaré 3 temas. En primera instancia, discutiré una forma de entender desde la noción de control democrático la concepción de la rendición de cuentas, tratando de incorporar aquí el tema de la participación ciudadana. La apuesta es muy sencilla. Pensar en participación ciudadana es pensar ante todo en la necesidad de incorporar una concepción más abierta, más inclusiva en la gestión pública, en el diseño de las instituciones, que no simplemente incorpore mecanismos de consulta, sino que también dé entrada a procesos deliberativos y resolutivos mucho más, que tengan mayor capacidad de incidencia. En segundo lugar, quiero discutir en qué medida los procesos de cambio institucional, cuál es la lógica del cambio institucional que ha establecido algunas limitantes, algunos obstáculos a la, por así de llamarlo, la democratización de lo público. Y finalmente concluiré con algunos puntos indispensables para pensar una agenda de democratización, una agenda de innovación democrática en México. Para los colegas que vienen de fuera de este país, probablemente resulte una discusión un tanto esotérica, un tanto especulativa, sin embargo, se inscriben en estos debates. En primera instancia, el punto aquí es para ir más allá de una noción un tanto plana de la participación ciudadana, es necesario incorporar la idea de democratic accountability, que se traduce de una manera insuficiente, pero aproximada, como control democrático. Estamos pensando, en ese sentido, el control democrático como una forma de conducción de la acción pública en su sentido más general, que se basa en principios de inclusión, contestabilidad, justificación y responsabilidad. A grandes rasgos, estas son normas que pueden estar presentes en mayor medida en distintas formas de diseño institucional, pero constituyen en este momento, tal como lo estoy enunciando, simplemente un fundamento normativo. En esta concepción, hay que decirlo, estamos proponiendo una doble manera de entender el control democrático. Por un lado, se ha puesto demasiado énfasis, me parece, en la necesidad de supervisar, sancionar, hacer responsables a los representantes, a los legisladores, a los gobernantes y a los funcionarios públicos, dejando de lado que la noción de democratic accountability también incorpora un sentido de colaboración, de coparticipación, de reciprocidad. No es sencillo implementar elementos que cumplan con estas dos funciones, que incorporan estas dos dimensiones, pero son, sin embargo, elementos que deben ser tenidos en cuenta en el momento en que se piensan mecanismos específicos de participación y de incidencia ciudadana. Aquí hay una... no salió muy bien el gráfico que presentaba, pero básicamente el propósito de esta diapositiva es señalar que a grandes rasgos, en su sentido más abstracto, el propósito del control democrático es maximizar la intersección entre expectativas públicas, entre decisiones públicas y los resultados de esas acciones. En términos del debate académico, aquí es muy importante señalar que cuando se habla de darle un lugar central a la ciudadanía en los procesos públicos, es muy fácil asumir que los ciudadanos tienen preferencias homogéneas y que simplemente se trata de hacerlos partícipes en la toma de decisiones. Sin embargo, el concepto de control democrático tiene que incorporar también las preferencias heterogéneas de la ciudadanía, muchas veces en conflicto, intereses divergentes, antagonismos que se presentan al interior, no solamente de los órganos legislativos, sino también de la propia esfera pública. Y también es necesario incorporar las alternativas que son incompatibles. Si simplemente pudiéramos maximizar la utilidad pública haciendo todo lo que consideramos que es bueno y posible, lo haríamos. Sin embargo, hay escasez de recursos, hay procesos, ritmos distintos en la obtención de ciertos resultados y hay opciones que simplemente son contradictorias. El tema es que, siendo estas condiciones de todo proceso de decisión y de acción pública, tienen que ser siempre sometidos a procesos de revisión, de escrutinio, de deliberación y en última instancia las decisiones que se adopten, las acciones que se implementen pueden pueden no tener un respaldo unánime, pero no por ello dejan de ser sometidas a control democrático. Y en ese sentido, que entrando en una dimensión más específica, hay que dar cuenta de la diferenciación institucional que se requiere para incorporar tanto en los procesos de decisión como en los procesos de implementación una estructura compleja, diferenciada y sofisticada de control, supervisión del gasto, de las políticas, de los resultados, de las evaluaciones. Al mismo tiempo, no pasando por alto que el control público no puede estar desintegrado, no puede estar descoordinado, que ese es un tema clave para el caso mexicano. Pero voy a lo siguiente. Se me olvida que tengo el control, perdón. También aquí medio se desacomodó la cuestión. Para quienes han seguido el debate en México acerca de la rendición de cuentas, simplemente quiero recordar que hay una diferencia en la manera en cómo se plantean los temas. De entrada, se reconoce casi de manera consensuada que la rendición de cuentas electoral no es suficiente para controlar al poder público. Y en ese sentido es que se alude a la necesidad de incorporar mecanismos horizontales y mecanismos sociales de Contraloría y de rendición de cuentas. A mí me parece que es necesario todavía dar un paso más adelante que ese planteamiento. Sí, este planteamiento todavía está inserto en una concepción del control democrático que sigue la idea de un régimen de jerarquías y transacciones, como lo plantean Carol Royce y Matthew Shugart. Este sistema es básicamente el sistema de pesos y contrapesos que le da una función central a la representación y al control que se realiza mediante las elecciones. La teoría democrática, la teoría sobre la rendición de cuentas, ha discutido otras formas un tanto metafóricas, un tanto analógicas, pero no por ello menos sugerentes para entender o para invitarnos a pensar maneras más complejas de entender la construcción de un régimen de control democrático. Es, por ejemplo, la noción de la democracia de monitoreo de John Kane, la democratización mediante la gobernanza de Mark Warren, o inclusive las aportaciones del propio grupo de la red de Almudena Osejo, Ernesto Isunza y sus colaboradores, que nos permiten pensar a los regímenes políticos, a los regímenes de gobernanza y control democráticos como una estructura reticular de agencias e instancias que están sometidas a distintos mecanismos de control, colaboración y supervisión mutua y conjunta, sin que esto implique que haya una estructura única de la cual dependan todos los demás factores y elementos del sistema. Bueno, es una revisión un tanto apresurada de temas que sin duda son un tanto abstractos y no por ello son sencillos. Quiero señalar que durante la última década en México se ha desarrollado, se ha impulsado en muy diversos planos una agenda muy diversa de cambio institucional dirigida a incorporar a la ciudadanía en la toma de decisiones públicas. Leyes de participación ciudadana, instrumentos de Contraloría Social, etcétera. El punto a resaltar es que si hacemos un balance un tanto drástico y un tanto enfático, tendríamos que decir, y me hago eco de varios colegas que han trabajado estos temas y que han planteado estas cuestiones, habría que decir que el balance es un tanto adverso. Encontramos, en términos de Ernesto Isunza, por ejemplo, una disposición hermética por parte de los funcionarios, de los gobiernos hacia la participación ciudadana. Algunos problemas relacionados con esta cuestión se manifiestan como el traslado hacia áreas periféricas de la política pública, todo aquello que tenga que ver con participación. La reducción de la idea de participación a mera consulta o a mero acceso a archivos un tanto desorganizados de la administración pública. Implica también manifestaciones muy evidentes en distintos planos de control, de cooptación de quienes forman parte de estas agencias emergentes. En suma, hay que preguntarse cuáles son las causas, cuáles son algunos de los elementos determinantes de esta democratización insuficiente de la participación pública, por así decirlo. Yo quiero decir que no es sorprendente estos resultados que estamos viendo después de una década o poco más de innovación participativa, por así decirlo, si consideramos, como se ha mostrado en diversos estudios, que el sistema de contabilidad, el sistema de control de gasto, los sistemas de supervisión y de coordinación gubernamentales e intragubernamentales en México son fragmentados, son descoordinados, duplican funciones. En ese sentido, de manera estructural, hay condiciones que no favorecen la integración de cierto tipo de política pública coherente, congruente y sujeta a rendición de cuentas. Por otra parte, también hay que señalar que las capacidades de los gobiernos, tanto el gobierno nacional, los gobiernos locales, estatales y municipales, son capacidades diferenciadas en términos de recursos, recursos monetarios, recursos humanos, inclusive la sociedad civil está fragmentada también en términos de sus propias capacidades. Básicamente, la gran mayoría de las organizaciones con una suficiente profesionalización técnica y capacidad de incidir en la política y en la gestión, se ubican en la Ciudad de México. Fuera de la Ciudad de México existen muy pocas organizaciones que sean interlocutores necesarios de los gobiernos locales. Pero más allá de estos dos componentes de capacidades y de integración del sistema de rendición de cuentas, me parece que es necesario resaltar lo evidente. Es difícil implementar transformaciones de fondo en el funcionamiento de las instituciones en la medida que todo cambio institucional implica redistribuir poder e institucionalizar la incertidumbre, para emplear esta terminología. Esto es nada más y nada menos que cualquier mecanismo que abra espacios de consulta, espacios de deliberación, implica en alguna medida que quienes tienen en ese momento la autoridad o el poder podrán verse sujetos a procesos cuyos resultados no podrán controlar. Otro elemento, otro elemento necesario para entender estas dificultades de cambio institucional se ubican precisamente en que alrededor de las estructuras que funcionan en el poder público hay equilibrios estratégicos de distintas formas, grupos de interés funcionarios que se benefician, que obtienen beneficios, que obtienen rentas de la manera en cómo están funcionando las instituciones. De tal forma que cualquier cambio, cualquier posibilidad o intento de cambio no simplemente se enfrenta a la necesidad o no se enfrenta a una condición ideal en la cual se crea o se añaden elementos a un status quo ya de por sí favorable. Por el contrario, lo que tenemos en el contexto nacional, en el sistema de rendición de cuentas mexicano, es que ante todo tenemos que construirlo revirtiendo un equilibrio que estuvo pensado para funcionar durante décadas como un sistema fundamentalmente opaco, arbitrario e ineficiente. No empezamos de cero, empezamos de menos cero. Hay algo que quiero resaltar, ya me queda poco tiempo, pero básicamente mi argumento se basa en la idea de que no es posible desligar el funcionamiento de las posibilidades de innovación democrática en la gestión pública, en la acción pública, del funcionamiento del régimen electoral. Fundamentalmente, nuestras instituciones electorales están pensadas están construidas, no necesariamente están pensadas como tales, pero nuestras instituciones electorales de representación democrática añaden limitaciones a un poder ya de por sí limitado como es el del poder electoral. Si las elecciones en general se consideran insuficientes para hacer rendir cuentas, en México estos son un mecanismo todavía más insuficiente debido a factores muy conocidos: la imposibilidad de reelección, las restricciones que tienen los partidos políticos a la postulación de candidatos, etc. Hay un sinfín de temas que son del dominio público y que aludo de esta manera. Y en segundo lugar, el diseño de nuestras instituciones representativas no contribuye ni a la formación de mayorías decisivas, ni tampoco a que la pluralidad sirva para fomentar acuerdos cooperativos. Esto conduce al siguiente equilibrio, y con esto voy cerrando. El régimen electoral en México genera incentivos para que los funcionarios, los políticos, tengan horizontes de corto plazo. Hay poca inversión en el desarrollo de capacidades institucionales y hay una tentación frecuente, inmediata, cotidiana, de revertir avances institucionales. La inestabilidad institucional está asociada a los cambios en las mayorías legislativas que se pueden encontrar tanto a nivel nacional como en las entidades federativas. Y esto implica también, está relacionado con una natural necesidad de reducir la incertidumbre de quienes tienen horizontes de corto plazo. Quienes tienen horizontes de corto plazo no necesitan meterse en problemas relacionadas con que haya agentes cuyos intereses son desconocidos y que quieren participar y que quieren deliberar y que quieren ser copartícipes de las decisiones. Por tal motivo, es muy común encontrar evidencia. La historia reciente en el México contemporáneo nos puede ofrecer múltiples casos que ilustran estos puntos. Esfuerzos explícitos por reducir la autonomía de las agencias gubernamentales o estatales, desde el IFE, el IFAI, los órganos electorales subnacionales, las comisiones de derechos humanos, etcétera. Hay tela de donde cortar. Y finalmente, la politización y partidización de los espacios públicos. Todos estos son elementos que constituyen un equilibrio y un conjunto de posibilidades en los cuales se enmarcan las posibilidades de cambio y de transformación en un sentido participativo. Concluyo señalando lo siguiente. Esta es mi conclusión. Una transformación congruente del sistema de control democrático en México tiene dos agendas que cubrir. Por un lado, es ineludible repensar la estructura del régimen, la estructura de incentivos del régimen político. No se puede transformar los equilibrios estratégicos que prevalecen hoy en día en todos los niveles de gobierno si no se genera un sistema que permita construir mayorías responsables. Mayorías plurales, mayorías de la naturaleza que ustedes quieran, pero mayorías responsables en el sentido de que están sujetas a diversas formas de control y colaboración. Y esto se complementa con la necesidad de repensar un sistema congruente, integrado, de control democrático, que incorpore elementos participativos, que esté articulado a los elementos de control del gasto, de evaluación de resultados y de redefinición de políticas públicas. Es un mapa muy general, lo que les estoy presentando, sin duda que ofrece de manera muy gruesa algunos de los elementos que están presentes en el debate, pero espero que sirva también como un elemento a tener en cuenta en esta tarea de repensar la incidencia ciudadana en un sistema integrado, un sistema coherente de rendición de cuentas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro Monsiváis, quien nos ha planteado la rendición de cuentas como un desafío democrático que por consiguiente debe de incorporar aún los intereses más antagónicos y divergentes y todas las alternativas. Y bueno, quiero comentarles que una personalidad también que iba a estar aquí con nosotros, dado su gran interés, nos ha mandado su material, su exposición. Se trata del señor Daniel Kaufman. Él es presidente del Revenue Watch Institute. Como economista ha sido pionero en la innovación de instrumentos de medición y análisis de gobernabilidad y corrupción. Cuenta con una gran experiencia práctica asesorando a países a formular y llevar a cabo reformas de gobernabilidad y ha sido director del Instituto del Banco Mundial. Tenemos a continuación una participación también brillante del doctor en economía Daniel Kaufman. Le escuchamos, por favor.
Por haber organizado una conferencia tan importante con eminentes panelistas mexicanos y del exterior. Me disculpo, es una gran pena para mí también de no poder estar con ustedes en forma personal y acompañarlos todo el día, sino solo por intermedio de este vídeo, pero espero que la próxima vez y en el futuro próximo que eso sea, podamos estar juntos. Así que si me permiten solo unas reflexiones a estas alturas, donde no voy a pretender resumir toda la riqueza de lo que se ha discutido hoy en día, especialmente porque no he logrado estar con ustedes todo el día, sino solamente abarcar unos 2 o 3 puntos en forma bastante breve, algunos de aquellos que ya los hemos discutido con varios eminentes panelistas presentes y participantes. Obviamente el desafío de combatir la corrupción es un desafío todavía muy pendiente. Se han hecho ciertos avances en varios lugares en el mundo, en otros han habido retrocesos y también se ha aprendido bastante y eso se ha demostrado en la riqueza de la discusión que ustedes han tenido hoy día. Así que nuevamente los felicito por la iniciativa. El primer punto que vale la pena recalcar, aunque muchos de los aquí presentes y nosotros ya lo reconocemos por un tiempo, es de que ya no tiene sentido intentar combatir la corrupción combatiendo la corrupción en forma burda, con otro edicto o otra ley más, cuando básicamente todos los países del mundo tienen leyes y en los libros por lo menos que son adecuadas. Comenzando otra campaña contra la corrupción con muchas conferencias y discursos, adoptando una nueva ley o comenzando con otra comisión contra la corrupción o por la ética, no son del tipo de iniciativas que hoy en día se reconoce dar resultado. En vez de eso hay que mirar el desafío de la corrupción en forma mucho más amplia y también en forma mucho más profunda, buscando las razones fundamentales por las cuales existe la corrupción. La corrupción siendo muy importante, pero es un síntoma de debilidades institucionales en el Estado y también fuera del Estado. Todo el asunto del nexo con el sector privado es muy importante en este contexto. Así que hay que mirarlo en forma mucho más abarcadora de que sencillamente preguntarse cuánto petty corruption o sobornos pequeños y coimas hay. Obviamente eso hay que mirarlo y hay que seguir enfocándolo, pero no es parte de lo más fundamental al nivel estratégico hoy en día. El asunto de grand corruption a nivel ya más alto y ciertas expresiones mucho más fundamentales y sutiles de la corrupción hoy en día deben tener mucho más prominencia. Una de ellas, y eso quería recalcar como el segundo punto que nos conlleva el primero, es lo que hemos llamado corrupción legal. No toda la corrupción es estrictamente ilegal según las leyes del país en el momento. Corrupción legal, que hemos escrito al respecto, donde el enfoque es en lo que no es ético, pero puede ser en el área legal o por lo menos extralegal y no estrictamente ilegal. Mucho lo que ocurrió en la debacle y la crisis de Wall Street, desde un punto de vista estrictamente legal de las leyes en ese momento, antes de Dodd-Frank, no fue ilegal, pero obviamente faltó ética, faltó gobernabilidad en forma fundamental y hubo corrupción. Todo lo que se está viendo más recientemente en cuanto al escándalo que comenzó en Inglaterra con el Barclays Bank, pero también otros involucrados, con cómo se manipuló los intereses, las tasas de intereses internacionales del LIBOR, es otro ejemplo en ese sentido. Cuando la corrupción legal llega a extremos, puede llegar a la influencia tan grande e indebida de los potentados del sector privado, oligarcas en muchos casos, sobre las políticas del Estado que puede resultar en lo que hemos llamado la captura del Estado. Así que la captura del Estado en realidad es una forma, una expresión más extrema de corrupción legal. Y cuando existe tal captura del Estado o ciertas variaciones de captura del Estado, el costo social, el costo a la sociedad, el costo al desarrollo puede ser enorme. Es mucho más sutil, como decía, pero puede ser mucho más pernicioso que la corrupción burda en la forma de un soborno a un policía, por ejemplo. Así que es muy importante hoy en día enfocarse en eso. Cuando uno mira las causas fundamentales de la corrupción, obviamente hay que mirar a las instituciones en forma amplia y profunda, y hay varias instituciones en este caso muy importantes. No les voy a quitar y robar mucho más tiempo enumerándolas, ya se ha discutido y ustedes las conocen. Todas las instituciones muy importantes de rendición de cuentas que un Estado tiene. Pero quiero mencionar una iniciativa que también es una institución en cierto sentido que es muy importante, y eso es la transparencia. Obviamente transparentar como reforma institucional es sumamente importante. Un país como México ha tenido avances muy importantes en ese caso y hoy en día se debate más aún todo el asunto de leyes de acceso a información, de cómo implementarlo a nivel estatal, etcétera, que es sumamente importante. Y hay muchas otras iniciativas en el campo de transparencia, incluyendo los portales como Compranet y otros. En el marco de recursos naturales está el Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, la transparencia para los recursos naturales, que es muy importante para países acoplarse al EITI, incluyendo, se espera, México en el futuro no lejano. Y otras iniciativas en este sentido. Al mismo tiempo, es importante recalcar que transparencia, si queda muy solita, no va a tener los resultados esperados. Transparencia con impunidad o transparencia sin sanción, sin rule of law o Estado de Derecho, imperio de la ley, obviamente va a tener resultados mucho menores que cuando hay una interacción entre las dos. Entonces hay que preguntarse en cada caso, y en cada país es distinto, tiene su contexto, cuáles son las 3 o 4 instituciones y reformas fundamentales para tener un impacto sobre la corrupción. Y en general nunca es solo una, es la interacción entre 3 o 4 prioridades que son importantes, donde es muy común que las reformas judicial, Estado de Derecho, Rule of Law, para que haya menos impunidad y más sanción, cuando interactúan, cuando se ligan con la transparencia, tiene un impacto mucho más grande que si solo una se hace. Y en este marco, el último punto que quería recalcar es que también es muy importante enfocarse en los sectores más importantes del país. Un país como México, pero hay 60 otros donde nosotros los hemos estudiado en profundidad. Recientemente sacamos un reporte al respecto, porque en Revenue Watch, donde dirijo la organización, nos enfocamos en los países que son ricos en recursos naturales. Es muy importante el sector de recursos natural en más de 60 países, obviamente incluyendo el caso de México, enfocándose en cuáles son las características y desafíos más importantes en cuanto a gobernanza, en cuanto a las instituciones en tal sector, puede tener un impacto macro, un impacto nacional enorme. Así que hay que mirar y preguntarse en cada caso, cuando uno formula una estrategia de país, cuáles son los sectores muy importantes. Y recalco hoy en día, en este momento, el desafío en los recursos naturales también, porque es un momento político sumamente importante para vuestro país, para México, para toda América Latina, en cuanto a las propuestas que se están debatiendo hoy en día, que son tan importantes para abrir y reformar el sector petrolero, el sector energético, en el caso mexicano, que puede tener implicaciones enormes para el desarrollo del país, pero también para el asunto de gobernanza y la lucha contra la corrupción. En resumen, concluyo primero diciendo de nuevo de lo importante que consideramos mirar el asunto de corrupción en forma más amplia dentro de un marco de gobernanza e institucionalidad y preguntarse cuáles son las reformas más amplias que se requieren y dentro de eso mirar a los sectores más importantes. Pero segundo, y aún más importante de nuevo, quería agradecerles esta oportunidad, felicitarlos por esta iniciativa tan importante que ustedes han montado hoy día y espero que estas propuestas que ustedes están haciendo hoy en día y todos los papers, artículos que se están escribiendo tengan la influencia que se merece en cuanto a la próxima etapa de reformas en anticorrupción y mejorar gobernanza. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. No cabe duda que esta es la ventaja de que hoy podamos comunicarnos a distancia y tener la participación del doctor Daniel Hoffman, que nos ha presentado los desafíos y características justamente de un proceso de rendición de cuentas y los mecanismos jurídicos que en ocasiones, lejos de frenar el fenómeno de la corrupción, lo permiten.